So we're going to have a little bit of a discussion today. I woke up to a message this morning from my co-host on Analog Allies, Brett. Link in the description box down below. We're live every Thursday at usually 11 p.m. Eastern. But he sent me a picture and said something along the lines of, look at how far handheld gaming has come. And I understood what he was saying with that. I understood the message he was trying to convey. But if you know anything about me, you know that my mind works in a very different way than like a lot of other people's, for better or worse, I should say. And my mind immediately went to like a completely different place with it. My mind immediately went to, damn, I really miss dedicated handheld gaming consoles. I feel like the industry, the video game industry as a whole, is in a potentially worse place because of the death of these handheld dedicated gaming consoles. Now, I know we have things like the Nintendo Switch. I know we have things like the Asus. Yes, it's actually pronounced Asus. So I guess you're supposed to say Jesus instead of Jesus. I don't know. That was weird to me when I figured that out. But you have the Asus ROG Ally, the Steam Deck, the MSI Claw, the PlayStation Portal. Handheld gaming has changed a lot. It's changed dramatically over the past decade or so. But I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing. I think because of this shift, we now have this huge gaping hole, within the video game industry because of the death of the dedicated handheld gaming console. So I kind of want to talk about why I feel that way. But first I want to talk about like my history with these systems because, spoiler alert, I'm old. So, I was in there on the ground floor, man. I remember getting my Game Boy. I got a good report card. Went to KB Toys. The video game section was in the back side of the store. And my mom was like, you can get a Game Boy. And I was like, yes, this is the greatest day of my life. I picked up a Game Boy with Super Mario Land 2, the 6 golden coins as the pack-in title. And I also picked up Alleyway because it was like $20 and my mom was like, you can get this, it's $20. I want to say the Game Boy itself was 70 or 80 with the pack-in game. And I just instantly, fell in love with it. Obviously, you couldn't really play it at night. Those long car rides to places, you would be relying on the highway lights in the back seat of the car. But, just such a cool system, being able to play a variety of games that are ports from the consoles, games that are developed and dedicated to the handheld itself. Just an awesome experience. I remember playing Mortal Kombat 2 in church. I felt like such a cool little kid. And then, of course, I got a Game Gear. I remember getting it in the North Carolina mountains. We were celebrating a birthday of mine. And we were in a cabin, and I got a Game Gear with Sonic the Hedgehog 2 as the pack-in title. And I couldn't play it because my parents didn't get me batteries, so we went down to the bottom of the mountain to the general store. They didn't have Energizer. They didn't have Duracell. They had Everready with the stupid little cat on them. I got to play Sonic 2 for about 20 or so minutes before my 6 AA batteries died. And then I just had to look at it for the rest of the time. But, the Game Gear. And then we go to the Game Boy Advance. We used to bring that to Arby's when we would skip second period in high school. Because Arby's, they had a smoking section, so we could smoke cigarettes, eat roast beef sandwiches, and play Game Boy Advance games with a link cable. The DS, the PSP, the 3DS, the Vita. All just really awesome and unique experiences that are gone. They are completely gone. And I don't think they're ever going to come back. I don't foresee, one of these big companies ever making a dedicated handheld again because they've kind of, when it comes to Sony, they've completely abandoned that. When it comes to Nintendo, they've merged their divisions into together. And in theory, that's not a bad thing. But I think in practice, like dedicated handheld gaming was very important for a myriad of reasons. First off, your price of entry. These dedicated handhelds, these dedicated handheld games were not as expensive as the console counterparts. They weren't as, big of an experience, but some of these games had huge experiences within them. It's just that when you look at like the budgets of these games, like, yeah, it wasn't as big as some of the heavy hitters on like the PS2 or the PS3 or stuff like that. But that allowed for more creativity. That allowed for companies to take risks with these handheld games that they couldn't necessarily, take on a console because of the rise in the development cost with this new technology of these systems and stuff like that. You were more restricted on the handheld side of things. The DS was essentially a little bit better looking than an N64, more clear as far as visuals were concerned. The PSP was like a lower end PS2, like an early PS2 launch title. So companies would work within those restrictions and make unique experiences based on the hardware itself, based on things that the hardware had built into it. Whether it was the Wi-Fi connectivity of things like the PSP or the DS, or, the touch screen, the microphone. It allowed for unique experiences that, yeah, sometimes they worked, maybe sometimes they didn't, but you could take that chance. You could take that risk. Even looking at like your favorite franchises that now take, 10 years to get a new entry in, you didn't have to worry about that with these dedicated handhelds, because first-party companies were making games at a rapid rate for these handhelds. And you got, familiar experiences with different outcomes. Stuff like the Grand Theft Auto games that came out on the PSP, the God of War game that came out on the PSP, unique experiences with the Legend of Zelda and Mario games. You don't have to worry about having this massive, huge budget and selling millions and millions of units, because it doesn't cost that much to make. You could be more creative. You could take more of a risk. You could really just do whatever. You could really create what game you wanted, and it would probably, if it's a good game, it's going to sell decent enough. Being able to visit, the world of Vice City with like different characters and new mechanics, even something as simple as like Super Mario 64 DS, like adding in those additional characters, adding in 4-player mode. Like, it was so cool. It was so unique. And then, of course, you had games that were built for the system in mind and just for that system. You had a vast library of games, and it felt like, there was your favorite franchise was always just around the corner, whether it was with a console version or a handheld version. You had shorter development cycles. You had smaller budgets to take more risks, to really be more sort of creative. And when you look at, how video game distribution is now, we do have these lulls, with first party games. And you never really had that before when you had these dedicated handhelds. And yes, like I get it. You have this new wave of dedicated handhelds with things like, the hybrid nature of the Switch and these, handheld mini PCs. And like, they're cool, don't get me wrong, but it's not the same. It's really not the same. Your handheld mini PC is just playing your library of games at a lower resolution. The Switch is probably the closest thing to having something that is a dedicated handheld because of the nature of it. But I still don't feel like it's an exact replication of that, because you don't have a separate ecosystem. You don't have a separate, cheaper alternative. And you don't have the ability to make a game for a system that you don't have to sell millions and millions of copies of. Some of my favorite gaming memories are from handheld consoles, like Metroid Prime Hunters on the DS, playing that game online for hours and hours and hours. And when you would come across a hacker We learned that if you ran away from, you couldn't unplug the wireless router that I had in my apartment, but if you ran down the stairs of my apartment and ran down the street, it would disconnect and it wouldn't count as a loss. So you're going up a trace that you're sniping in the head and they're not, dying or anything like that. You'd run down the stairs. You'd run across the street. You'd wait for that connection to drop. And you're like, hey, I'm not taking an L. I'm not losing this thing. It was just a different time frame. And you could talk about how great these hybrid and mini PCs are. And I mean, you're not wrong, because they are able to do things that obviously, something like this Nintendo DS Lite can't do. But look at how portable this is. This would literally fit in your pockets, even if you're a skinny jeans wearer. Are you fitting a Switch? Are you fitting a ROG Ally in your pockets? Are you fitting a Steam Deck in your pockets? And if you are, how much battery life are you going to get out of that? Like, that's the biggest restriction for these things, is the battery life. The Switch probably has the best battery life out of all of them. And I wouldn't say it's great. I wouldn't say it's good. I would say it's decent. Maybe 2.5, 3 hours, depending on the game that you're playing, depending on the brightness level and stuff like that. And that's on the high end. You look at stuff like the Steam Deck, the ROG, some of those games that are, visually demanding, hour and a half, maybe 2 hours if you're lucky. They're not really portable. They're just handheld. Whereas in this era, you had cheaper hardware, cheaper games designed for the hardware, better battery life, and a larger output of games, and more games that took creative risks, more games that, went off the deep end, went in sort of a different way without having to worry about any repercussions, because, your development cost was so much smaller. And just things like that, man. Things like that really stick out in my mind. And it's just like, this is now a part of history. Things like the PSP, things like the 3DS, the DS, the Game Boy. This is all a part of history that I don't think is ever going to be replicated. If you're growing up now, you're never going to probably go back and experience something like this. And more importantly, be able to understand something like this. Understand why this was so important at the time. Understand why this was a very positive thing for the video game industry, because it allowed for choices. It allowed for creativity. And it seems like every day we're getting less and less choices when it comes to platforms. And I don't know. It's a shame. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have some very interesting stories when it comes to, dedicated gaming handhelds, whether they're positive or negative, because, I am kind of romanticizing this. Obviously, there were games that were developed for these handhelds that weren't good, that didn't hit the mark, that relied on a gimmick too much or something like that. And I get that. But I think the positives far outweigh the negatives when it comes to, pretty much everything with these. It was an alternative, a cheaper alternative that was more budget friendly, more wallet friendly. And now in the era of a, $500 video game console, you're going to tell me that a $150 handheld with $30 games wouldn't be an attractive thing for customers to pick up for some of their favorite franchises, some of their favorite characters? I don't know. It's not my decision to make, though, is it? Unfortunately, it's not. Well, whoop, there it is. That is a saying I'm trying to bring back, by the way. That's what I got to say about dedicated handhelds. And I want to hear your stories in the comments section down below. Because like I said, I feel like, kind of depending on your age, maybe you hit this era, maybe you didn't hit this era, maybe you got in at the tail end of the 3DS and the, Vita and stuff like that. But give me your thoughts on it. Because I really feel like it was such an important thing. It was such an important thing as far as just everything. Accessibility, pricing, battery life, new experiences, unique experiences. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you are new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Be sure to like, comment, and share. Hit the bell as well so you don't miss any more uploads. And as always, I'll catch you guys on the next video. Later.